It is such a pleasure to be back here and back at the corner of 57th and Woodlawn, where I first came when I was 17 years old to check out this place called the University of Chicago, and I've been in love ever since. This place never leaves me, and it's a delight to be back. It's a particular delight to be back in Chicago, where, as you know, there are only two seasons, too hot and too cold. I'll leave it to you to figure out which one we're in today. I'm going to talk for the next few minutes about my experiences, but I want to talk with you. And the one thing that I learned at the University of Chicago more than anything else is that an event like this is interactive, and that means that I want you to interact with me. This is not like Mrs. McGillicuddy's third grade where you have to raise your hand for permission to interrupt. You do not have to do that. You are encouraged to interrupt. You are encouraged to dialogue, as young people claim is a verb. You are encouraged to challenge me. You are encouraged to disagree with me. And you are encouraged to try to draw me out a little bit if I don't quite hit the points that you're interested in. So please feel free to ask me anything you like. I'm particularly a big fan of impertinence. Any of you who've been yeah? Okay, I found my first one here. Any of you who've been saving string to ask about the issues that surround where I've spent my life, big-time journalism. If you want to ask about bias, I'd be happy to talk to you about it. If you want to ask about the process, of course, I'll be happy to talk to you about that. And if you want to talk about the famous politicians of Washington and the press, we'll talk about that too, whatever you like. Let me begin way back when, in the summer of 1972, when I was a young reporter at the Washington Post, and I got a front row seat over the next 3 years into what I think is unarguably the greatest series of moments in the history of our business. For 3 years, I sat right between Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein throughout Watergate. I heard every bloody word of the whole thing. You talk about sausage factories and sausage. I was in the factory. I was right there. And there were several effects of that. One was that I led the league in screaming out on deadline, "Would you guys please be quiet so I can do my work?" There were clusters of editors around these guys every day on into the night. That was number one. Number two was that I actually got to do, early in Watergate, a couple of process stories. If you dig deep in the internet somewhere, you will find my byline over an indictment of the 5 Cubans who were arrested at the Watergate office building. And then a couple of days later, before anybody had any idea what any of this was about, another court story of an arraignment of one kind or another. And so the third effect of all of this is that there's been a lot of debate, almost all of it in my own mind, about who would have played me in the movie if history had gone a little differently. I've always campaigned for Paul Newman, but I think you can see my hair. It probably would have been Donahue. Actually, this happens to me in Washington all the time. The wages of sin, sir, you will identify. When people look at you, all they see is your hair. So forever and ever and ever in Washington, I can be on the subway, I can be walking down the street, and tourists will come up to me and say, "Excuse me, sir, are you Newt Gingrich?" Because all they see is the hair and the wide face and all of that. So Washington can be a treacherous place. Watergate was a fantastic run for the guys, for the newspaper where I spent 36 years. But it created a situation, an unholy alliance, I like to call it, between the press and the institutions of politics and the politicians that exists to this day, and I think is getting worse by the minute today. As triumphant as Watergate was in so many ways, clearly the greatest moment in the history of journalism in our country, I think it has caused a lot of downstream problems for journalism, for politics, and for the people of the United States. That doesn't mean that Watergate should not have happened, but it does mean that even here we are, where are we now, 42 years later, still wrestling with what the lessons here ought to be. Here are the problems that I see. And again, I want to encourage all of you to jump in if you want to further comment or anything. The problems here have become that since Watergate, many journalists have gotten into the business for reasons of vengeance and not reasons of journalism. For all these 42 years, the enrollment figures at journalism schools have gone up and up and up. They're still going up. I have taught journalism at 5 major universities, and what I see there is people who walk in the door and who don't want to learn the trade craft, who don't want to learn about the ethics, who don't care about balance and fairness. They just care about bagging them a president. They think that Watergate was about vengeance and assassination. They also think that Watergate proves cynically that a newspaper's politics will drive the subjects of its investigative reporting. They don't understand that when, in my case, the Washington Post publishes a line of type on the editorial page every day that says, an independent newspaper, that Watergate was still not a hit job on Richard Nixon. It was not. And I want to go into that for a minute because some of you may not be aware of all the ins and outs here and all of the self-canceling politics that go on here. The executive editor of the Washington Post, the guy who hired me, who is my main man forever and ever and ever, Ben Bradley, the most wonderful, famous editor in the history of our country. Let me just interrupt for a second. Back in the fall, right after the Washington Post was sold, we who'd worked there for a long time put together an evening to say goodbye to Don Graham, son of Catherine Graham. And 700 people came from all over the world to this event, and I was the MC of this event. It was a great honor, and Bradley was there. He's 92 years old, and he is still the most fantastic guy in the whole world. He walked in there, and you know, women are dropping dead at his feet. He's 92 years old. That's been going on for a long time. He's amazing. Ben Bradley came through journalism at a time when the separation between who your friends were and what your journalism was nowhere near as acute as it is today. Ben Bradley was a next-door neighbor of a young congressman from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. Ben Bradley was unabashedly a Democrat. Ben Bradley wrote several, I think I can call them fawning books about John Kennedy. And Ben Bradley was the editor of the Washington Post as Watergate began to crest. And everybody said, you see, this is just a big Democratic hit job. This is a way to get even with a group of Cubans who broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee. But it wasn't that way at all, because the methodology that went into Watergate reporting, the result of it, not Nixon's resignation, but the buttressing of our institutions. Nixon resigned because various institutions worked in sequence. It was not an assassination, it was actually the development of a chain of events that led to hearings on Capitol Hill, that led to the legal system getting into it, and eventually led to an outcome that I think was inevitable from the first minute. But understand what the ethics of journalism were then and are still today at places like the Washington Post, every other major newspaper, every major television network. Let me tell you what I lived with for 36 years, and you will understand how seriously big media take this. For 36 years, I could not belong to a political party. It was a condition of employment at the Washington Post. This is a right that any of you have. I gave up that right as a way to work at the Washington Post. I could not give money to any organization, any. I could not give money to the PTA at my kid's school. I could not go to a demonstration This is in the Bill of Rights, kids, the redress of grievances and all that, right? This is why we fought the British. These are the things that we tried to do. I voluntarily gave up those things. There was almost a mini revolt at the Washington Post back in the 80s when the then editor of the Washington Post, Leonard Downey Jr., who succeeded Bradley and who famously never voted and never votes, he never votes. We're not talking about in primaries, he just never votes because he thinks it could unconsciously influence him. Leonard floated this policy where he said that not only could I not march in a demonstration if I chose to, but neither could my wife, my children, and if I didn't happen to have a wife, my significant other could not march in it. Well, that was a little much for a lot of people, and so we pushed on that, and Leonard finally pulled that back. But understand the culture here. Journalism does not do hits just to do hits. Journalism investigates. Journalism, and we'll get into this a little bit later if there's time, journalism plays out a long string of syllogistic work. It does not go to market too soon. By the way, I think this is one of the major problems of the internet, and it's one of the reasons why great journalism has not surfaced on the internet yet. The very availability of the internet and the speed of it is the enemy of what we're talking about here. All of these careful restrictions were in place throughout Watergate. They're in place right this minute. But other restrictions were there too. And I want you to understand what went into the Watergate work and what since then has gone into every kind of deeper investigative reporting of politicians. Bob Woodward, a remarkable reporter, I think the most gifted reporter of my generation. Bob never talks about politics in an electoral way, but you can draw your own conclusions. Bob's father was an elected Republican judge from the North Shore of Chicago. Bob belonged to a country club when he was 14 years old. Bob went to Yale at a time when Yale didn't do anything but Bob Woodwards. There were almost no blacks, no Jews. There were literally no women. There were no foreign students. There were no minorities of any kind. Bob went to the United States Navy. He was an officer in the United States Navy. He decided he wanted to be in journalism, and he came to the Post. And the day he sat down beside me, I thought, this guy is the most humorless person I have ever met in my life. And I think I still believe that. I'm not too jealous of Bob because Bob now has had 14 #1 best-selling books, and Bob has the greatest deal in publishing. He doesn't even have to tell Simon & Schuster what his next book is about. He'll just call up Simon & Schuster and say, I'm going to do another book, send me $5 million, and they'll do it. And then a week later they'll say, by the way, what's this book going to be about? So here's Bob. Carl Bernstein was the oldest child of two people in the Washington area who were members of the Communist Party. Carl was, for those of you who know what this means, a red diaper baby. Any of you not know what that means? Young people, you may never have heard, you don't know what it means. Communist couples used to wrap their children in red diapers as a symbol of their membership, but also in hopes that the little beautiful kid would grow up to be a communist himself. And so Carl Bernstein was a red diaper baby, and he used to laugh about it and love to talk about it. And Carl's politics were just so obviously on the other side. So, does this sound like a likely duo, Batman and Robin, going to take on the President of the United States because they hate him? Because they hate Republicans? No. Every single story in Watergate, and there were more than 400 across 3 years under this famous double byline, was not published until every fact in every story was double sourced. Now, for any of you who have ever had anything to do with journalism, you know that as glorious and as glamorous as this sounds, a lot of journalism and a lot of my life has been spent at 10 o'clock at night, sitting at a desk, hoping that somebody would please call me back so that I could get the last little fact into the story so that I can do it. Woodward and Bernstein worked an average of 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for 3 years on this story. Could it be done again? Sure, it could be done again. But understand that everybody who sees this as some kind of a political assassination really is wrong. What it is an evolution of the standard journalism process that was just done to a degree that had never been seen before because the scope of this story had never been seen before. Okay, what has it meant for politics and for politicians? Well, clearly it didn't do a lot for Richard Nixon's career. And clearly what has happened since is that the press is not welcome at the gates of politics in any way the way it used to be. When I started at the Washington Post, it was nothing at all to call up a United States senator and ask to interview him, and he would welcome you into his office. He would pull down his tie and take off his coat and say, "Bob, let's talk." Today, if you can get that interview at all, you're going to be ushered into that office only if you submit a list of questions in advance. During this interview, a public relations person will be filming and recording every single bloody word, and you will be lucky to get 10 minutes. Who loses? Well, the reporter certainly loses, but all of you lose because, and this is the key point to this entire evening and this entire discussion, journalism is a transaction. It is not something that is rained down on the unsuspecting masses from 35,000 feet. There is no journalism without 3 points of the triangle: reporter, subject, consumer. That's why understanding how journalism works and politicians allowing journalism to work would be a nice idea. We're not there. In fact, we are not there because of, ironically, the very success of Watergate. That's when things began to change. There have been dishonest politicians before. Excuse me, there will be some in the future. There will be reporters who work as hard as Woodward and Bernstein. There are now. And then there are people in our country, where are we, 320 million people now, who are living in an era that's just a dream to me. Here we have this fantastic country of ours where we have more educated people than ever, we have more complicated news than ever, we have more difficult politics than ever, so shouldn't we have better and deeper and more thorough journalism than ever? Sorry folks, Twitter. 140 characters, and baby, you better use every one of them because you're not getting any more. If you can't tell the story in 140 characters, bye. That's how impatient and how skin deep we have become. And we become that way in another dangerous way, and I want to explain this to you, and we can understand together what this means for politics and the coverage of politics. If I took you into the newsroom at the Washington Post tonight, here's what you would see. You would see the same hopeless slum that I lived in for 36 years. Huge piles of junk, dust, styrofoam coffee cups half full of coffee that have been sitting there for 6 years. You know, we used to joke at the Post that if Ben Bradley really had any power, he would make sure that the fire inspector never came through the place, because if they ever had, I would have been out of a job a long time ago. The big difference in the newsroom of today is that right up in the center of the newsroom is a great big tote board about 40 feet square, and it pulsates and changes. And this is the running score of which stories on WashingtonPost.com are attracting the most hits. Young people, older people, you must not forget this phrase: search engine optimization. Everybody understand what this is? This is a measure of how many hits a certain story will get. It is an invitation to perversion and warping. Let me give you an example. If I were covering a story tonight about Bill Clinton, who is now the head of the Clinton Foundation. And I wanted to write a 6-paragraph story that said that the Clinton Foundation had given a grant of $100 million to fight child poverty in Africa. That story would in no way threaten to make the big board. But I don't have to tell any of you, particularly the young people here, that you can set your electronics to be notified immediately if certain organs like the Washington Post mention a person or a subject that you're interested in. Bing! You will be notified. So, if I wrote this story about Bill Clinton today and my 6 paragraphs said, President Clinton, comma, the 42nd President of the United States, comma, was impeached for having sex in the Oval Office with Monica Lewinsky, ping, 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 search engine optimization, put it on the board. Look at what this does to coverage. Look at where it can be abused. And what if I said to you, ladies and gentlemen, that the number of times you make the big board at the Washington Post is factored into your performance evaluations at the end of the year, that you can get a bonus for making the big board a lot of times. Maybe this will be the make or break on whether you get a raise that year. Look at what can happen here. I call this the flasher effect. In other words, you can attract a lot of attention in this world by walking down Woodlawn Avenue in a raincoat, wearing nothing underneath and doing this. But how much light does that really shed? How much value is there in that? Not much. The Washington Post still has a full-time staff of 16 investigative reporters. There are not many newspapers or any other organs around that employ that many people. But where that comes out is very difficult in this age because these people often go a whole year without writing a thing. And when they do, those stories are tested and they are not read very well. So the issue becomes, the lesson of Watergate is stick to your knitting, do your knitting, do it fairly, do it accurately, do it thoroughly, do it again if you need to, and the results will take care of themselves. The culture, the speed at which we live, the way that politicians now can control access to them is more suspicious and more cynical than ever because politicians know that they have nothing to gain anymore from deeper conversations with anybody. And please understand that I'm not talking just about electoral politics here. Those will always be with us. Politics means a lot of things, and I think this gets lost sometimes. Politics can mean morals, it can mean ethics, it can mean family life, it can mean neighborhood life, it can mean a whole lot of things. Anytime you talk about substantial reporting and you take away from it any element of sexiness, any element of personality, you're risking not having a lot of readers. Look at how we weld our coverage of politics to personality. This is just amazing to me. We got some of the most interesting issues in our country right now that we've ever had. I'll just throw one out, immigration reform. What a tremendously important issue for the future of our country. How is it reported over and over and over again in horse race terms? Which of the two major parties does it benefit most? Which potential candidates in 2016 does it benefit most? What does it mean for President Obama? Does he tick down or tick up? And it's just horse race, horse race, horse race. There needs to be a deeper and better kind of journalism that also brings people to it in a way that they're not being brought today. Issues coverage. I read a story this morning in the Washington Post, a very long story about the governor of Louisiana, Bobby Jindal, who is, at least in his own mind, a candidate for the Republican nomination in 2016. This story was about 45 inches long in a certain newspaper where I used to work, and in inch number 40, we got around to hearing what Bobby Jindal is really proposing as an alternative to the Affordable Care Act. Inch 40. The lead in the story said, Bobby Jindal is beginning to pin his 2016 campaign around an alternative to the Affordable Care Act. He wants to junk the whole thing and replace it. Then, from inch 2 to inch 40, it was horse race, ball game, tea leaf. No. This means money for him. This positions Ted Cruz here. It positions Rand Paul here. It might position Hillary Clinton here. And Andrew Cuomo had better watch out if Hillary doesn't run, because this and this and this. And then 40 inches later, we get back to what the story should have said in the second inch. Who's to blame? Well, I don't say that Watergate is to blame, because oddly enough, as full of impact as those stories were 40 years ago, they were not that well read either. Bob Woodward is so eloquent about this. Of course, he's still a friend. I love the guy. He still is probably one of the most humorless people I've ever known. He's pretty good on humor on this one. He said, you know, if the search engine optimization board had existed in 1972, I would have gone back into the Navy and become an admiral, and he might have had to. What does this mean for you? It means that we need to resolve the biggest issue in journalism before we're going to resolve the biggest issue in journalism's relation to politics, and that is, who in the world is going to make a go of the journalism business in the digital age? Folks, you better stop me, because I can talk about the digital age journalism issues, the business issues, for about 100 years. We'd be going on for a long time. There's never been a greater opportunity for journalism, not ever. I've said this to these young people before. Anybody who's a journalist and who's young today who wants to go into this business, you'd be crazy not to do it. You've got a chance at audiences that no one has ever seen before. Hundreds of millions of people. But nobody's got it right as a business yet. Nobody might ever get it right as a business. The very joy of the internet is the downfall of the internet. There's so many voices out there that it's really, really hard to listen. It's really hard to hear. What is interesting to me, and I hope to you, is that when we get into big story journalism in this day and age, even though there are countless blogs and 80, 11 zillion, trillion ways to get the same story or the same information, when there is a big story, all of the numbers show that everybody, young, old, black, white, west, east, north, south, come running to the heritage websites. We've just had a classic example of this, the disappearance of Flight 370. What a story. Wow. Where are we now? 3 weeks into this story, I think, something like that. I can't get enough of this story. I'm a news junkie anyway, and this isn't quite connected to politics, but it is in a way. It's connected to international politics. How very interesting that 11 nations were collaborating to look for this plane, but they didn't want to show each other their technology because of their own domestic concerns. What has happened, and this story was available anywhere and everywhere. It was available in foreign press. It was available here. You know what the 6 biggest hit sites have been in these 3 weeks on the 370 story? Let's make the list. Come on. New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS. That could have been the same lineup 40 years ago. It would have been. We're still in a situation where the big drives the small. We're still in a situation that first came up in 1968. Let's return now to those thrilling days of yesteryear when Richard Nixon was first elected president, and he chose as vice president an obscure governor of Maryland named Spiro Agnew, who came into office and, as vice presidents so often do, said, gee, what do you want me to do? And they said, we want you to go around the country and rile up the base. We want you to make some speeches. And they assigned to Spiro Agnew a guy named William Safire, who, interestingly enough, went on to a long career as a columnist for the New York Times. That was later. Safire was on the White House staff. So Agnew went around the country, and he attacked the press in this memorable phrase as being The nattering nabobs of negativism. You can almost dance to it, can't you? The nattering nabobs of negativism. Great phrase. Sapphire always said he wanted Agnew to take credit for the phrase, but he wrote the phrase. Sapphire wrote the phrase. But interestingly, Agnew said in this round of speeches that the New York Times and the Washington Post and the three major over-the-air networks set the agenda every day, and therefore they can conspire to drive the agenda everywhere else. That in Omaha and Wichita and Memphis and Seattle, they wouldn't have the first clue about what the news was unless the Times or the Post said so. And everybody said, oh, what do you mean? You know, we have a free press in this country. Everything's independent. Everybody makes their own judgments. He was right then. He would be right today. If the Times drives a story, if the Post drives a story, if a network drives a story, it has traction. And if Joe Website drives a story, I'm not sure he can. Even if he's Matt Drudge, always, even if he's Daily Kos, I don't care who he is. The internet is not there yet. And politicians know that, and politicians continue to ride over not only the heritage media that we're talking about, but the younger, newer, smaller media. The current president of the United States has had fewer press conferences than any president. The current president of the United States actively jumps over Spiro Agnew's great point of 45 years ago. The current president of the United States doesn't sit for interviews about a whole lot, except every year he reveals his March Madness picks on ESPN. And that's all terrific and wonderful and homey and great, and he's always wrong like the rest of us. But this is a symptom and a clue, I think, of where this is and where this is going. Nobody talks to the press now unless they think it's to their advantage. There is no such thing as friendship. There is no such thing as continuing access. And on campaigns, oh my heavens. I hope all of you understand how campaigns are organized, because campaigns fly places and they bus places. That's pretty much what campaigns are and do. And if you're covering a presidential candidate, let's say, and you're flying around the country with that candidate, you're not flying around the country with that candidate. You're flying around the country with 1 million other reporters in one plane. But the candidate's somewhere else. And you get to hear him 4 times a day make the same speech. And it's very difficult to develop a sense of the campaign because you are monkeys in the zoo and you're kept over here. And then in the bus, it's the same thing. And yes, you will have some time to interview people in the various stops, but how illuminating will that really be? Not clear. We're very, very cynical on both sides. We don't need to be. I hope we won't continue to be. But really, a lot of this is up to you. You who are not elected officials, you who are not in the media. People ask me all the time whether there will be a return to the great journalism of yesteryear. And I think the answer is clearly yes, that there could be. Clearly there should be. But this is going to involve the young people in this room primarily. Are you going to demand the kind of reporting that we saw in Watergate? Are you going to demand that this unholy alliance stop looking like a couple of mastodons stalking each other and really cooperate with one another so that the body politic learns? I think it's possible. I think it's actually more possible than ever, and I think young people will drive it. I'm going to shush for a minute. I like that sound of that right hand going up. Please, questions and comments, anybody?
Well, first, Mr. Levey, thank you again for coming out tonight. I'm just curious, were there similar concerns about the future of journalism when you were a young reporter and you were starting out?
My gosh, yes. They weren't the same concerns, but sure, the concerns then were whether the dailiness trumped accuracy. This is a concern today, but it was a big concern then. Because the system of doing journalism when I came into the business was different. Very often today, reporters are both reporters and writers. They do both. When I came into the business, the first day I walked into the newsroom at the Washington Post, there was a bank of about 20 people sitting there, older, who were called rewrite men. All they did was write. They never reported. So the police reporter would cover a grisly murder and he'd call his notes into the rewrite man. And the rewrite man would, quote, write it onto page 1 with flourishes and ruffles and perhaps some inventions here and there. No, perhaps, that happened. So yeah, the system was geared to a kind of literary inventiveness that was not the kind of journalism we've come to know and come to expect. So yes, there were lots of questions about that. But as, this is in the 60s, as the business began to be populated by more educated people and the readership got to be more educated, that tended to take care of itself. More questions? Yeah.
When you mentioned that today's Washington Post story on Governor Jinggo, and I was just wondering, when journalists are writing stories, do they have a target audience in mind? And do journalists write what they think the audience should know or would like to know?
Well, that's a wonderful question. No, there is no target audience, because to say that would be to limit your reach. If you're working for a big medium like the Washington Post, you are writing for everybody. That's both an art and a curse. It can mean that you've got to make some extremely delicate judgments about taste, for example. And you can never assume that you're writing just for adults, for instance. You've got to bear in mind that 8-year-old kids can be asking at the breakfast table, what does this mean, what does this mean? And that tends to neutralize journalism a bit. I think there are not as many chances taken for that reason. Language choices are a little more cautious. I'm sorry, the second part of your question was?
Do journalists write what they think the audience should know or would like to know?
Well, my dissertation about search engine optimization answers that in part, but a lot of duty journalism, process journalism, hearings, school board meetings, sewer board meetings, is what we used to call castor oil journalism. Open up, it's good for you, it won't taste very good, but here it is anyway, you really need this. That has been proven to be a loser in the marketplace, but it's a winner in terms of what we're talking about here tonight, where people really need to know this. And if it were not for journalism in some form, you would have spent your whole life not knowing what happened at your local school board. It has to be there. The issue is how, where, when, and where do you put it in the newspaper. Very seldom do school board meetings get onto the front of the Metro section or the front page. Maybe that ought to change, but I'm just not sure that it can. You know, when Lindsay Lohan's latest drunk driving arrest is going to bump that story not only off the big scoreboard, but off page 1. Yes, sir, in the back.
Would you say that journalism as a whole kind of is representative of what the people kind of think or what they want to ask the politicians the questions? Or would you say that it's more of the individual journalist kind of intuition on that? And then kind of as a result of that, how does that play out when dealing with politicians, whether or not you're acting as the voice of the people, kind of asking that politician that, or you yourself, the journalist?
Nobody elects a journalist, nobody ever has, nobody ever will. So this is not a representative spokesman sort of situation. A lot of it is very intuitive. However, it's well plowed ground now. Everybody knows pretty much where the news is and will be on the journalism side. And on the political side, I think the same is true. What you can never measure for sure is partly what I was just saying to her, that if one story in one newspaper has to serve a multitude of readers, it could be perceived very differently by different kinds of readers. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. People ask me all the time about bias in journalism. Not only partisan bias, but bias against certain races, bias against there is bias in journalism, and I'll tell you what kind of bias there is in big journalism. It's middle-class bias. There are assumptions made in the writing and editing of big newspaper stories and big television stories that the readers and viewers will be employed, educated, they will shower regularly, they will own things like cars and houses, and they might well be married and have children. It is very, very difficult to come up with the same kind of attention and voice consistently in big television networks and big newspapers. If you're single, if you're an immigrant, if you're gay, if you're out of the mainstream in any way, big media have a tremendous lot of trouble dealing with this. How to portray it, not just to you who's different, but to people who are in the mainstream. So don't misunderstand this, but one of the most interesting books I've ever read was in 1994. The managing editor of the Washington Post commissioned a book where every member of the staff, more than 1,100 people, got to write one page about him or herself. I still have this book. It's like this. You know, wise guy stuff, bleeding heart stuff, oh God, my mother wanted me to go to medical school stuff, all that sort of stuff. And then in this back of this book was a listing of where these 1,100 people lived in the Washington metropolitan area. They lived in one particular part of Washington, they lived in one particular county in the Maryland suburbs, and they lived in two particular counties in the Virginia suburbs. All of them among the most high-earning places in the United States. What does that say? I think that's your answer. That it's not that big media are trying to intuit what is going on in these other places, but if there's a murder in one of these other neighborhoods where they don't live, by definition, it's going to be like walking in and covering an alien event. This is a difficult problem. It'll never be easy. It'll never be entirely solved. But at least everybody on all sides of this equation is aware of it now, and I think some strides are being made. Yes. Hi.
Hi, how are you? I'd like to push back a little bit on something that
Oh,
you said.
no, don't do that.
I think while you're right that in a lot of ways big media drives most of the conversation, I think the internet has moved beyond just making big media uncomfortable to actually changing some of the stories that they cover. I think you see this in the way that a lot of network TVs sometimes clumsily try to include Twitter on their main screen. And recently, for example, like that hashtag cancel Colbert about Stephen Colbert, there was a lot of protesting about some joke that he made on his show. A lot of media had no idea that was going on, and were only prompted to pay a lot of attention to it because of some activists on Twitter. And so I do think the mentality is shifting a little bit, slowly. Do you think that's a good thing?
I think it's a great thing. You're not pushing back at me. I agree with every word you said. The more voices there are in this, the better. The more challenging of assumptions, the better, and the more that informs the editing process. I think it's great. I don't think that Twitter is the be-all and end-all of reporting, and I certainly don't think that anybody with a cell phone camera or a notebook is a reporter. And you've heard me rant, and I'm going to do it for you now, about Reddit. Oh my gosh. Let's take another look at Reddit. Okay, you and I have argued about this before, but a guy walks into a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado and starts shooting the joint up. Remember this? A year and a half, 2 years ago? Number of people had handheld devices, had access to Reddit, and they were posting like crazy. You know, anybody can be a reporter, anybody. Every single thing that was sent out on Reddit in the first 10 minutes of that episode was wrong. Every single word was wrong. Newtown, Connecticut. Remember? Oh my God, oh my God. It was the other brother who was doing the shooting. Remember that? Wrong name. Remember that? Wrong number of kids dead. Remember that? Wrong number of teachers dead. Remember that? Just time and again. So yeah, I think it's great that this is part of the process, but there's never going to be any substitute for being deliberate and accurate and slow. Not first, right. And if you got to slow down and you got to be second, you have to live with that, and you have to trust that the audience, the third point of the triangle, is going to respect that more than they will respect oh my gosh, there's a guy in a movie theater who's shooting up the place with bombs and automatic weapons. Not true, not true. Yes.
You mentioned Ben.
I like your hair, by the way. It's,
I get a few snickers when I go back to Johnson, mention him or things. But you
Let me
mentioned-
make clear, by the way, that I covered the Lyndon Johnson administration. I'm old, but I'm not Andrew old.
I think I have to do that too. But you mentioned Ben Bradley.
Yeah.
He was a good friend of Kennedy's. And they, I believe they met pushing their strollers. For
You
their-
got
for
it,
their
sir.
two
They were
children,
next door
right?
neighbors with children the same age.
I used to see Kennedy come to his front door there to name his cabinet and whatnot. But they were great friends. They were socially very compatible, they and their wives. Would that be, is it true today? Has any president had any close contacts in the media like that? Or should it have been possible in those days? Kennedy would give Bradley tips to stories.
All the
at
time.
White House parties and whatnot.
No is the answer. The last president I'm aware of who had a close relationship with a reporter was Gerald Ford. And that relationship was based on his time in the House, and it was based on his time with reporters from the newspapers in Michigan, which he represented in Congress. And he just got to be pals with them. That really was the point I was trying to make before, that kind of friendship was possible in the 60s and 70s, and it wouldn't even begin now. I am not aware that the President of the United States, today's President, has a single friend in media land. It certainly was not the case with either Bush. Some of the Clinton friends were journalists, but not really close friends. I think you'd have to go all the way back to Ford to find that. And then before him, you'd have to leap all the way back to Kennedy. I don't, Nixon, no, not at all. I mean, let's see, before Kennedy, Eisenhower, not really. Truman, some. Roosevelt, lots. But now we're back 80 years. Sir?
I was just going to say, I mean, you know, the concern about too close a relationship relates to all sorts of questions about conflicts of interest,
Sure.
manipulation, things that are problematic potentially for the accuracy and quality of the journalism. The problems on the other end, which you've talked about, have to do with just a lack of access, understanding, trust, and therefore information is not forthcoming, and journalism as a result suffers therein. So what is the proper relationship, as you see it, between the way journalists and particularly elected officials or their sources more broadly should engage with each other?
Courteous and distant, mutually respectful, and social. I think that if
And
you,
social.
yeah, if you put them in rooms together, and you don't say, you guys have to be best friends, but at least see each other in the course of your everyday lives or in your professional lives, I would be very uncomfortable with inviting a member of Congress to my child's wedding and then covering that congressman. I wouldn't do that. But long, long ago, for 8 months, one of the best assignments I ever had in journalism at the Washington Post was to cover parties in Washington. I covered them for the style section. That was a great job. I'd go to a party, I would talk my way in, and there in various states of inebriation would be members of the United States Senate and the United States House of Representatives. It was a great challenge as a journalist because I had to waltz up to these people and say, and to get a story from them by getting them to talk to me. But I also had to decide whom to talk to. So it was an art and quick study, quick deadline stuff. That was great because you would see people in their natural habitat, people who I think are naturally outward, as politicians almost always are, relaxed, lubricated a bit, lubricated more than a bit. This is how I would do that. I would allow for this without going so far that you're being compromised or that you seem to be compromised. Yes.
So first of all, thank you very much. I want to address something that has been an issue definitely here in this country, but also internationally, which is the media talking to not only a specific group of people, but with a specific ideology or a specific agenda behind it. And I ask this question because, so I come from Venezuela, definitely you know there, if you are pro-government or against government, like there's no in between, there's no serious journalism nowadays in Venezuela with maybe one exception. But you also see it in respected countries like the UK with The Guardian, or and here with MSNBC, Fox News, etc. And we're not talking about people who are just pundits. We're talking about a whole enterprise, a whole business trying to go for an ideology, and it's becoming even more and more intense in that way. Is there any chance that at some point serious journalism is going to come actually back to being objective?
Yes, and here is what's going to happen and what needs to happen. Thank you for your question. An old hobby horse of mine, fearless prediction, that in the next 5 years, the major newspapers in the United States and the major television networks are going to get out of the business of endorsing candidates. It cannot come a moment too soon, ladies and gentlemen. This causes problems. This causes questions like yours. When you ask that question, you really mean, how can, in 2000, the Washington Post endorse Al Gore on its editorial pages and then claim to be objective in covering George W. Bush? Well, the answer is that it can happen. There is a high, bright wall between the editorial side and the news side. We know this. You don't know this. We've never sold you on how high and how bright this wall is. So, to paraphrase Ronald Reagan, tear down that wall. It's time to tear down that wall and do away with this for many reasons, not the least of which is that nobody pays attention to newspaper endorsements anymore. Nobody's kidding anybody. It causes so many problems out on the trail for political reporters and for politicians. And everybody snickers and says, oh, well, you know, the Post endorsed Gore, that must mean that they're red diaper babies the way Carl was. It doesn't mean that at all. So solve the problem the way it needs to be solved. Sir, let's do him first. I'll get back to you.
On the same path.
Yeah.
Would you say that advertisement is used by politics in order to make some pressure on what is going to be told by the media or not?
Sure. But you got to peel it a little deeper and say, what politicians have decided to do is just to do a money arms race forever and ever and ever, and to buy ads forever and ever and ever, more and more for all time. And now that the Supreme Court has ruled yesterday that the more money can get into these campaigns than ever before, woo, sure. Advertisements are meant to persuade not just individual voters, but opinion makers, and that would include big media, absolutely. Okay, sir, sorry.
Yeah, I have two things on my mind, maybe you can help me. I've been part of the peace movement for Israel and Palestine.
Mm-hmm.
And in the late 80s, there began to be polls about what Americans thought about a two-state solution.
Mm-hmm.
And the polls showed that, well, most American Jews, 52, 55, 60%, in favor of that.
Mm-hmm.
And our group wanted to get the media to report this story. And we actually got some money together and hired somebody that went to CNN, went to San Francisco Chronicle. We had a big meeting with the whole editorial board at the Chronicle. We talked with somebody who was a reporter from CNN. CNN guy said, I love it, we got to do this, I'm going to do it. I'll get right back to you as to just how we want to run this story. Well, I'm afraid we can't do that story. No explanation. And from the San Francisco Chronicle, while we had long discussions, all we got when we had a Israeli general come to give that, Matty Pellet come and give that presentation on two states, we got about that much in the calendar section. That is, there was something intervening of a political sort that did not want this story to happen. And it is that kind of politics in the media that I'm concerned with, and that's the first part of this question.
Can I comment?
Please.
I don't think this is political. I think this is a question of upsetting people, and the courageous leaders of some of these organizations not wanting to do that. This is, as you know, probably the most difficult story in the world right now. I think it has been for a long time. Doing this story fairly and thoroughly is very challenging, either on the ground or here. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be written and broadcast. I agree with you that it should be written and broadcast, but a lot of managers run in fear of letters to the editor, and run in fear of picket lines, and run in fear of advertisers deserting. You're a big boy, I'm a big boy, that's what happens. That doesn't mean that it's political pressure. It could mean, I think it does mean, that it's business pressure.
Okay, then another even more difficult story. The events of September 11, 2001.
Mm-hmm.
The families of people who have survived that are not satisfied with the investigation. There's no way jet fuel at 800 degrees could burn these timbers, these steel and cement. There's no way that a fire could turn into dust 2/3 of the whole structure of that building.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason in any scientific criminal investigation the steel should have gone to China. There's no reason that we don't find, what about this nuclear debris that is found there? And what about the debris of thermite? So this is a story that, you know, Bernstein and so, you know, if they spent 3 years on, or if any reporter, to get out this fact, 911 is truth is not printable.
It's printable, it may not be gettable. You can't print what you ain't got. The problem is developing the right facts here, and understanding the mood of readers is driving a lot of this. There's an enormous pressure in our country to move on, as you know.
Move on when there's clearly some criminal operation that has gone on that is being covered up.
But if you're a Woodward and Bernstein and you cannot get an FBI agent to say that there's a criminal operation being covered up and here's what I'm doing, if you don't have the sources, you don't have the story. I'm not disagreeing with you, sir. Let me tell you a story. I was in Dallas, Texas last week, and I had an hour to myself, and I'd never been there, and I took a walk down to Dealey Plaza. This is where Kennedy was shot and killed in 1963. We've just been through the 50th anniversary. It's a rainy Tuesday morning in Dallas, Texas, and I walk up to the grassy knoll. I've seen the photos a zillion million times. There are 100 people standing there, 51 years later almost, carrying picket signs demanding a new investigation of whether Oswald acted alone. Yeah, there are loose ends in that. There are tons of loose ends in the Warren Commission report. But journalism is not history, and journalism is not subpoena power legal investigation. Journalism is immediate. It is the first rough draft of history. It is not history. Doesn't mean it can't be accurate. It has to be accurate. But it needs sources, it needs traction, and it needs some sense that this is ground that has not been plowed 1,000 times. I looked at these 100 people walking around with picket signs in the rain, and I said, is this going to go on the 100th anniversary? Yeah, it probably is. I probably won't be there, but isn't that amazing? Maybe it isn't amazing to you, but I mean, maybe it shouldn't be. But yeah, there's always more to look at, but what's news is new, and what's new is news. And that's what drives everybody in the journalism business.
Let's take a couple more questions here.
How are we doing on time here?
We'll do about 2 or 3 more.
Okay, 2 or 3 more, yeah. Let me take somebody I haven't asked.
So first of all, I'm dying to ask you more about these parties, but I'm gonna.
I'm yours.
Question.
I am yours.
So it sounded earlier like you were lamenting the volume and rapidity of news or quasi-news on the internet or another new medium. Certainly, I'm ignoring Twitter. Some of the more Politico, something that might be considered a little bit more. And I was thinking, could an argument be made that these are helping, you specifically mentioned immigration, and I was also thinking like environmental policy, policy areas that are not getting sufficient attention at the national level that might emerge from grassroots movements. Is this, even though I agree that all of this volume is detrimental, is this helpful to these policy areas?
Sure, it should happen, it has happened a little bit, it needs to happen much more. But it always gets transmogrified into some kind of horse race journalism and some kind of who's up, who's down journalism. The Keystone Pipeline, for example, I have a suspicion you're familiar with that. This is the largest oil pipeline that's ever been contemplated in North America, and Obama's against it, and he's getting smashed from left and right and up and down about the jobs that won't be created if he blocks it, and the energy independence that we'll have in North America if he blocks it. But it never really, the journalism never really talks about the likelihood of environmental damage and what's being done to control it. Very rarely is that covered. Just last week there was a huge story in the New York Times about the lobbying by the Canadian business interests in the United States for this pipeline. Who wins, who loses, who gets rich, who doesn't get rich, but nothing about what would happen if there's a real spill in Nebraska. What would happen? It's not in the story. Should it be? Of course. Would it light up the big board in the middle of the newsroom at the Washington Post? Not in a million years. Not in a million years. So we all need to find our way through this issue of policy, gist, and sexiness. It's all in the stew. One more?
Let's take one more.
Yeah.
What can our generation do to make journalism better? Like, what are some concrete actions we can take?
Demand better, more thorough work. Don't cave in to Lindsay Lohanism. Do not subscribe to People magazine. Kill it. Smash it. Jump up and down on the cover every week. I'm very, very confident that you're going to do that, as I said before, because you people particularly who are in the vanguard of educated young Americans, you're not going to settle for Twitter. It's amusing, but it's not a meal. If you want meals, you will get meals. People talk about the business problems of journalism all the time. The business problems of journalism follow you. They don't lead you. Where you go every day to consume your news determines who will win and who will lose. You know these newspaper boxes you see on the corner? Put in 50 cents, open the thing, get your tie caught, reach in there, pull a newspaper out. Every time you vote with your 50 cents, that has ripples that you just, it's enormous power that you have on your side. Everybody thinks that reporters and editors have all the power, bloggers, columnists have all the power. You have all the power. Everybody should understand.
That's a very fitting note to end on.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.